Ed McMahon said 7 words. Johnny Carson's world stopped. The Tonight Show had been on the air for 17 years. 30 million people watched every night. Johnny Carson had interviewed presidents, movie stars, and legends. He'd laughed through 10,000 monologues. He'd never missed a beat. He'd never broken character. But on this night, in front of the entire country, something cracked. The cameras were rolling. The audience was laughing. And then Ed McMahon leaned forward, looked directly at Johnny and said 7 words that no one in that studio was prepared to hear. What happened next wasn't scripted. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw. It was real. And it became one of the most unforgettable moments in television history. If you want to know what those 7 words were and why they shattered the man who never broke, subscribe now, because what you're about to witness changed everything. It was a Tuesday night in November 1979. Studio 6B at NBC Burbank was buzzing with the usual pre-show energy. Crew members adjusted lights. Doc Severinsen warmed up the band. The audience filed into their seats, excited for another night with America's favorite host. Johnny Carson sat in his dressing room going over his cue cards. He looked tired, not the usual kind of tired that comes from doing 5 shows a week for nearly 2 decades. This was different. Something heavier sat behind his eyes. His assistant knocked on the door. 5 minutes, Johnny. He nodded, straightened his tie, and walked toward the stage. Ed McMahon was already there, standing by the curtain, holding his ever-present coffee mug. They'd been doing this together since 1962. 17 years, thousands of shows. They didn't need to talk much anymore. A glance was enough. But tonight, Ed looked at Johnny a little longer than usual. He saw something Johnny thought he'd hidden. The band played. The curtain opened. Johnny walked out to thunderous applause, flashing that iconic smile. He waved to the crowd, sat behind his desk, and launched into his monologue. Jokes about Congress, jokes about gas prices, jokes about disco. The audience laughed right on cue. Everything seemed normal, but Ed, sitting just off to the side, kept watching. He knew Johnny better than anyone, and he knew something was wrong. Halfway through the monologue, Johnny paused just for a second. His hand lingered on a card. His smile wavered. Then he recovered, delivered the punchline, and the audience roared, but Ed saw it. That flicker, that crack. Johnny Carson stopped mid-sentence. The entire studio froze. He was about to introduce the first guest when he glanced down at his desk. There, tucked under a stack of papers, was a folded piece of paper, a letter. He brought it from home, not intending to look at it during the show. But now, in front of 30 million people, his hand moved toward it. The cameras caught every movement. The audience went silent, unsure of what was happening. Had leaned forward in his chair. Johnny didn't respond. His eyes scanned the letter. Once, twice. His jaw tightened. His hand began to shake. The letter was from his son, Rick Carson. It had arrived that afternoon. It was short, just a few lines. But those lines carried the weight of years of distance, years of mistakes, years of a father who'd been everywhere except where he was needed most. The letter read, "Dad, I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if it matters, but I needed to say it. I'm proud of you. I always have been. I just wish I had told you before now." Johnny placed the letter down. He looked up at the audience, but he wasn't seeing them. He was somewhere else, somewhere far away. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 15. The producer in the booth started to panic. Cut to commercial. Keep rolling. And then, Ed McMahon did something he never done in 17 years. He stood up, walked across the stage, and sat down in the guest chair directly across from Johnny. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for a cue. He just moved. The audience watched confused but captivated. Ed looked at Johnny, really looked at him. And then in a voice so quiet the microphones barely picked it up, he said 7 words. "It's okay to miss him, John." The studio went completely silent. No laughter, no applause, just the hum of the lights and the faint rustle of the curtain. Johnny's face crumpled. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just the way a man's face crumbles when he's been holding something in for too long. And finally, someone gives him permission to let it go. His eyes filled with tears. He tried to speak, but no words came. He just shook his head, pressed his hand over his mouth, and looked away from the camera. Ed didn't move. He didn't try to fill the silence with a joke. He didn't try to save the moment. He just sat there present, steady, letting his friend break. Backstage, the producers were in chaos, but Johnny had made a choice no one would have ever allowed. The band stayed silent. Doc Severance held up a hand, signaling them not to play. The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay quiet, so they stayed quiet. For 30 seconds, America watched Johnny Carson cry on national television. The man who made them laugh every night. The man who never faltered. The man who always had the perfect line. He had nothing. No jokes, no charm, just grief. Finally, Johnny took a deep breath. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looked at Ed, and managed a small, broken smile. "You're a good friend," he whispered. Ed nodded. "Always have been." Johnny turned back to the camera. His voice was hoarse. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. I didn't plan for that." He paused, composing himself. "My son Rick, he wrote me a letter today, and I realized I haven't been the father I should have been. I've been here every night for all of you, and I'm grateful, but I haven't been there for him. And tonight, reading his words, I couldn't pretend anymore." The audience began to clap, slowly at first, then louder, then they stood, all of them, a full standing ovation, not for a joke, not for a performance, for honesty, for vulnerability, for the courage it took to be human in front of millions. Ed reached across the desk and squeezed Johnny's shoulder. Johnny nodded, exhaled, and said, "We'll be right back." The screen cut to commercial, but in that studio, no one moved. The crew stood frozen. The audience remained standing, and Johnny Carson sat at his desk, staring at the letter, tears still streaming down his face. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. When the show came back from commercial, Johnny didn't do his usual banter. He didn't introduce a guest. Instead, he asked Doc Severinsen to play something soft. Doc nodded and cued the band into a gentle, melancholic melody. Johnny sat back in his chair, hands folded, and began to talk. Not to the audience, not to the camera, just out loud like he was talking to himself. "You know," he said, "I've spent my whole life making people laugh, and I love it, I really do. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that the people who needed me the most weren't out there." He gestured to the audience. "They were at home. My kids, my family. I chose this desk over the dinner table. I chose applause over being present." He looked at Ed. "You ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Ed didn't answer right away. He just looked at Johnny with that steady, knowing gaze. Then he said, "Every single day, pal. Every single day." But this was the moment no one in the studio nor anyone at home ever saw coming. Johnny reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He held it up to the camera. It was a picture of him and his 3 sons, taken years ago at a beach. They were all smiling, young, innocent before everything got complicated. "This is who I forgot," Johnny said quietly. "This is what matters. Not the ratings, not the Emmys. These faces. And I had been so busy being Johnny Carson that I forgot how to just be John." Others just stared, unable to look away. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something else. Something sacred. Ed stood up, walked over to Johnny's desk, and gently took the photograph from his hand. He looked at it for a long moment, then placed it carefully on the desk, right next to the letter. He turned to the audience and said, "You know what Johnny Carson is? He's the best friend you could ever have, and tonight you're seeing why." The audience erupted in applause, but Johnny shook his head. "No," he said, his voice breaking again. "Tonight you're seeing a man who's been running from himself for too long, and I'm tired. I'm so tired." Ed sat back down. The 2 men just looked at each other. No words, no jokes. Just 2 friends sitting across from each other, sharing the weight of what it means to be human. Finally, Johnny turned to the camera. "If you're watching this, and you have someone in your life you've been avoiding, someone you've hurt, someone you need to talk to, don't wait. Don't be like me. Don't wait until a letter arrives and breaks you open on national television." He laughed, but it was a sad, hollow laugh. "Call them tonight, right now. Tell them what you need to say because life is short and we don't get second chances. The show didn't return to its usual format that night. There were no comedy sketches, no celebrity guests, just Johnny and Ed talking, sometimes laughing, sometimes sitting in silence. The producers didn't cut away. The audience didn't leave. And America watched transfixed as one of the most famous men in the world allowed himself to be completely devastatingly real. When the show finally ended, Johnny stood up, walked over to Ed, and hugged him. A long, tight hug, the kind that says everything words can't. The audience stood again clapping, some of them crying. The band played softly, and Johnny Carson walked off the stage, letter in one hand, photograph in the other. The next day, the phones at NBC were flooded. Thousands of calls, letters, telegrams, people from all over the country thanking Johnny for what he'd done, sharing their own stories of loss, regret, and reconciliation. The episode became legendary. It was never rerun. NBC deemed it too raw, too personal. But those who saw it never forgot it. Johnny never spoke about that night in detail, but years later in one of his final interviews, he said, "Ed saved my life that night. Not literally, but in every way that mattered. He gave me permission to stop pretending, and that's the greatest gift anyone can give." Ed McMahon passed away in 2009. At his funeral, Johnny's sons were there, all three of them, and on the program, printed in simple black letters, was a quote from Ed. "It's okay to miss him, John." That letter from Rick Carson. Johnny had it framed. It hung in his home office until the day he died. And the photograph from that night. It was placed in a glass case at the Paley Center for Media, alongside a placard that reads, "The night Johnny Carson reminded us that even legends are human." Share this video and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The legacy of that night extends far beyond a single episode of television. It changed the way people thought about talk shows. It changed the way people thought about vulnerability. And it changed the way an entire generation understood what it meant to be strong. Strength, Johnny showed us, isn't about never breaking. It's about having the courage to break in front of others, and trusting that they'll still be there when you do. In the years that followed, hosts like David Letterman, Conan O'Brien, and Jimmy Fallon all cited that episode as a turning point. Johnny gave us permission to be real. Letterman once said, "Before that night, we were all just doing bits. After that night, we realized we could be human." The 7 words Ed McMahon said, "It's okay to miss him." John became a quiet mantra in the entertainment industry. A reminder that even in a world built on performance, there's room for truth, there's room for pain, there's room for healing. Johnny Carson never regretted that night. In private conversations, he often said it was the most important thing he'd ever done on television. Than any interview, more important than any joke, because it reminded people that behind the smile, behind the applause, behind the carefully crafted image, there was a man, a flawed, struggling, deeply human man. And that man mattered just as much as the icon. The letter from Rick Carson wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning. Father and son reconciled. They spent time together, real time, not rush visits between tapings or hurried phone calls from dressing rooms. Actual, meaningful time. And when Johnny Carson died in 2005, Rick was by his side, holding his hand, telling him one last time, "I'm proud of you, Dad." That night in 1979, when Ed McMahon said 7 words and Johnny Carson broke down, wasn't just a moment of television history. It was a moment of human history. A moment when millions of people watched and thought, if Johnny Carson can admit he's hurting, maybe I can too. It doesn't make you weaker. It gives everyone else permission to be honest, to stop pretending, to reach out, to heal. The Tonight Show continued for another 13 years. After that night, Johnny told thousands more jokes. He interviewed hundreds more guests. But whenever someone asks what was the most important moment in Johnny Carson's career, those who were there, those who remember, always come back to the same answer. It was the night he stopped being Johnny Carson and allowed himself to just be John. The night Ed McMahon reminded him that it was okay to miss someone. The night an entire nation learned that the strongest thing you can do is admit you're not okay. 7 words. That's all it took. 7 words to break through decades of armor. 7 words to save a friendship. 7 words to change television forever. It's okay to miss him, John. Sometimes the most powerful moments aren't scripted. They're just human.